Growing up in Canada, there were rules in place regarding the media we consume that I wasn't aware of. You see, Canada has rules about the percentage of media aired that has to be specifically Canadian. On radio since 1999, it's been 35%. Meanwhile, when it comes to TV channels based out of Canada, at least 55% of all annual television shows broadcasted have to be Canadian. It may seem weird to other countries, but we have a very close relationship with the United States, speaking the same language, except for a bunch of stuck-up weirdos out east, and having almost identical cultures. It would be very easy for Canada to have all our media be entirely American, which would drown out any attempt at Canadian jobs being made through TV or radio. It was because of these laws that I was exposed to a lot of bad Canadian children's television growing up. We did get the cream of the crop of American television, usually delayed, but good shows like Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends or Ben 10 eventually made their way over here. But because of our media rules, a lot of times they were drowned out by inferior Canadian shows like Johnny Test or Fred's Head, which to this day is the worst television show I've ever seen. So the Canadian rules limited my media exposure, and I also further limited myself by ignoring one of the main children's channels. You see, growing up, Family Channel and Teletoon, our version of Cartoon Network, were channels 51 and 50 on my cable system. YTV, our version of Nickelodeon, meanwhile, was channel 25, and for some reason, it being that far away on the channel listings meant that I often ignored it, even though that's where things like SpongeBob, Drake and Josh, or Avatar: The Last Airbender was aired. Don't know why clicking 2 buttons instead of 1 was a deal breaker for me. You'd have to ask me age like 8. This limitation meant that I often just watched whatever I could tolerate on my 2 preferred channels, and this led me into what I believe is probably sole fandomship of certain shows. The biggest of which would be our subject for today, Di-Gata Defenders. This is a show that would air weeknights at 7:30 for a couple years, though despite airing a lot, I feel like I'm the only person in the world who remembers it. It's like every show, no matter how obscure, eventually has some video essay done on it that goes along the lines of, hey, remember this thing existed? Well, this show is so obscure, I've yet to see one for it. My story with this show begins like my story with a lot of other shows. In fact, most of the shows I enjoyed growing up. The advertisements would play, and whatever it was, I would think, that looks really stupid. So I would ignore it for several months until I randomly happened to catch an episode. Then I tolerated it enough to watch it again, and then I watched it again, and again, and again, and again, until eventually it was part of my nightly ritual. The amount of shows I can name where this pattern happened is pretty nuts. This, Dave the Barbarian, Kappa Mikey, just to name a few, all shows that I would come to love but started out dismissing. This is probably the apex of that, because while I eventually got into the show, there was a long stretch of time when I was obsessively watching the show every night and could even discuss the lore in depth, but still couldn't admit to myself that it was my new favorite show. I don't know why I was so stubborn in this case. Once again, you have to ask me from like 2000 whatever, maybe 6 or 7. But it's also one of my biggest grudges I've ever had against a piece of media. I'm a man who has a lot of difficulty in confronting his past a lot of the time, but this is one that's even worse than usual. With that said, my reasons for how I feel about this show in retrospect mostly have to do with Season 2. Meanwhile, Season 1, which is what we're going to be covering today, is comparatively inoffensive. Either way, given the fact that I'm probably the lone person who remembers this show, it falls to me to make this retrospective. But before we do, just so this video doesn't get marked for kids, fuck. Let's cast the power. Okay, wow. So first of all, I can pretty much remember the theme songs to all my favorite shows growing up, and even some of the ones I didn't like. Fred's Head was a friggin' earworm. But this is one that's always escaped me, and now that I've watched it again, I can see why. It's just a generic mashup of tribal chanting and techno, which does not stick in the brain at all. Even after watching the entire first season, I still can't for the life of me remember the melody off the top of my head, and every time I try to remember it, it gets mentally overlapped with the tribal chanting from the Linkin Park song When They Come For Me. It's not a bad song at all, it just has no lastability, and it's incongruous with the actual soundtrack to the show, which is often generic guitar licks. Though there is some techno thrown in here and there. So this is a show that has a lot of lore, and I mean a lot. If you go to the Wikipedia page, you'll find screeds of text talking about a backstory of a superpowered alien race coming to the planet, their powers being infused into the planet when they died, a rough geography of the world, and so on. There's a lot to go over here, but none of it really matters, and as a matter of fact, I wonder how much of this Wikipedia page was written by the creators, because I don't remember much of this ever actually making it into the show. Of the backstory, the necessary plot is thus. You have these powered stones, each representing one of 8 different sigils. Casting these stones in certain combinations will create varied magical effects. Incidentally, one of the 8 sigils has a very interesting name, so I'm just gonna play this clip.
She can't hear you!
Altus, Sum, Ogama, Nega,
That never gets old. Anyway, this world's society, Rados, was then built around these 8 magical sigils and the stones containing their powers, and it was basically determined that the most you can master is 2 or 3 stones. Otherwise, you risk the magic catastrophically backfiring. This means that all trained warriors who use the stones basically get mastery over 1 or 2 elements. You also have these guardians, which are cast from unique stones, and as the name implies, guards the caster, and you also have some other unique stones, most of which are referred to collectively as champion stones. That's pretty much the necessary lore, which brings us almost to the main setting. 12 years before the events of the show, there was a great war between the forces of evil called the Order of Infinis and the previous generation of Di-Gata defenders. Who are the Di-Gata defenders? Basically, they're generational guardians of the world who are each highly and vigorously trained in different combinations of stones to give a well-rounded combination of elements. They're not police because there is a police and prison system in this world, meaning the defenders are also not above the law.
You sure you know the way to this Gadishan prison place? Yeah.
They're more like a small team of ultra-powerful mercenaries specifically brought out when things go tits up. To give a more applicable cultural equivalent, they're basically this universe's equivalent of the Ginyu Force from Dragon Ball Z. Except not evil and a lot less flamboyant. Well, except maybe Eric. As far as the previous generation of defenders, Lord Nazmul, the leader of the Order of Infinis, had a guardian beast named the Megalith. Yes, I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you, but just imagine what it feels like to watch the show. This guardian was so powerful that it alone could have wiped out all life on the planet, and seemingly no amount of power could hope to defeat it. So the best the previous generation, and spoilers, all previous generations could do was pacify it using what's called the 4 Pure Stones. Doing so cost the previous generation of defenders their lives, and in the process they were able to ostensibly kill Lord Nazmul and his armies. However, the Guardian was eventually destined to break free from its prison, and so the next generation of defenders had to be taken away in order to be trained to stop it. So they were taken to a secret camouflaged training ground. However, 12 years later, Megalith's power suddenly surges and causes a massive earthquake, or groundquake since this technically isn't Earth, which exposes the young defenders' secret training location to the Order of Infinis, and despite their training being far from over, they're forced out of hiding and must attempt to save the world by once again finding the Pure Stones to pacify the beast before it has a chance to rise again. Though why the Pure Stones would even be lost is a mystery to me. Surely you'd have them locked up in a vault somewhere or something, or are they like the Dragon Balls where if you use them, they then fly off into the sky and you have to find them again? I don't know, I don't think an explanation was ever given. The cast of defenders in this new generation are Seth, played by Noah Cap, Melosa, often shortened to Mel, played by Martha McIsaac, who I actually thought was named Martha Mackelsack because, well, the I was capitalized and so it looked like an L. And brother-sister combo Eric and Kara, played by Dan Petronijevic and Sugarlyn Beard. Also, Canadian adults of a certain age will remember Sugar as one of the lead correspondents on YTV's The Zone back in the day, and now I feel really old. Additional fun fact actually, my sister literally wouldn't let me watch this show in her presence because she found Sugar's voice so irritating.
We won! 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 Woo!
I can kind of understand. I don't hate her voice, it fits the character, but her delivery can sometimes be a bit grating. Regardless, I still hold a grudge for that. Seth is the leader, a brash, headstrong, but confident young man who is assigned the leader of the crew ostensibly because he's the most skilled, but probably because his father was the leader of the previous generation. I call nepotism.
Well, when they fry us both, we'll ask the general to make note of the fact that I was your prisoner at the time. That way, you go out a winner.
Then there's Eric, who's the comedy relief of the show. He's a clumsy goofball who's a coward and pretty much exclusively communicates through screaming. But he's also the mechanically smart one, constantly developing machinery to help him and the rest of the gang along their way. If he was more confident, I actually think he would have been a better leader than Seth.
Finished?
Then there's Kara. She's playful, neurotic, and sassy in the way that only children can be, and despite her age and size, in many ways, she's actually more brave and capable than her older brother. But she also has a massive chip on her shoulder for the fact that she's the youngest and is constantly being treated as such.
Enough already! I can't take any more, Kara. You're safe. Hugs!
Huh?
She has a resentment for being babied and a never-ending desire to be taken seriously. Not helped by the fact that she's also handicapped. There was an accident when she was super young that permanently injured her legs, forcing her to wear boots that artificially strengthen her legs. Of course, designed by Eric. Dude's a rock star. Now, I would have been too embarrassed to admit this when I was younger, but Kara was actually my favorite character growing up, despite the fact that she was a girl. I felt a kinship with her because she was the youngest of the crew, and with me being the youngest of, well, more siblings than is probably necessary in the 21st century, I turbo related to her struggles as a kid. These days, though, I find that she bounces back and forth between being endearing and obnoxious, as only a kid can be. And upon a rewatch, my favorite character is definitely Eric. I find him to be the most charming character out of all of them. He's not brash and outgoing, but he has a quiet charisma about him, and his energetic portrayal is endearing as hell. I especially like his dynamic with his guardian Robotus, who's got quite the personality himself. If I'm being honest, there were a lot of times when Eric just gets shit on for no other reason than he's the one who's predestined to be shit on. And I tend to have issues with stories where characters I like are predestined to be the universe's chew toy. That's why I have a hard time watching a lot of early Drake and Josh, because I like Josh. But it does make it all the more gratifying when he does get the odd W. Then there's Mel. What is there to say about Mel? No, seriously, I'm genuinely asking. She's a character who for 2 seasons and 50 some odd episodes never displayed much of any personality other than being the book smart one.
Aw, how sweet are you? Not.
Are you serious right now, bro?
Even the Wikipedia page doesn't have anything to go on. Although, confession time? Possibly embarrassing confession time, depending on your perspective. Despite her having no personality, I did have a crush on her growing up. Of course, there are other characters, such as Adam, voiced by Jeremy Frum. Yes, his last name is literally Frum. A roguish anti-hero who allies himself with the Defenders despite being a criminal. He's introduced as a thief among a clan who ambushes the Defenders, but he changes loyalty immediately because he has the hots for Mel. His personality mirrors Seth in a lot of ways, which is why they butt heads so much. They're very similar, but also have very different moral standings, given the fact that one's a born and bred hero and the other is a street-dwelling criminal, and despite constantly allying himself with them, from moment one, you're never quite sure where Adam's intentions or his loyalties lie. Though they definitely give Adam way too many chances. Each one of these characters are defined by the sigils they cast, each giving them a set of elemental powers, although the word elemental is stretched to breaking point. Seth, for example, has powers based around darkness, whatever that's supposed to mean. Meanwhile, Eric has powers based around machinery, which usually entails metal and fire. Mel has the power over ice, and Kara has the power over wind and electricity. Then there's Adam, who has a lot of weird unspecified attacks that the Wikipedia article defines as stealth-based attacks, which I call bullshit on, as if a naturally occurring power stone can define stealth-based attacks. That's even more vague than darkness as a power, because at least darkness is a thing that exists in nature. Now, if you hear the summary, a show with an eclectic crew of heroes, each with a different elemental power made in the early 2000s, you may think, huh, that sounds an awful lot like Avatar: The Last Airbender. And you would not be the only one. There are a lot of structural similarities as well. The brother-sister main characters, the first 3 episodes being about going to a temple/monastery, an entire chunk of the story before the main plot kicks off, which is just a series of Adventure of the Week style episodes, which is also where the worst episodes take place. An ally who's an anti-hero and also has a familial connection with one of the main antagonists. I mean, come on guys, the youngest member of the crew who happens to wear all green is also disabled. But now that I've looked at the release dates, it gets more complicated than that. Now, the release dates were a year and a bit apart, which could indicate some level of inspiration, but if there's one thing I know about animated shows, it's that from conceptualization to pitching to refinement to the finished product takes a really long time. So it's hard for me to know if a year and a bit is enough time for there to be inspiration from one to the other. In fact, the connection between Toph and Kara is almost certainly a coincidence. The first appearance of Toph was exactly 3 months to the day before Di-Gata Defenders premiered, when an episode's production cycle is usually about 6 months. Wrap your mind around that. I decided I wanted to get a deeper look into the making of this show so I could get some answers on what inspired it, so I decided to watch the Making of DVD. Yeah, this is a bonus DVD that came with the lone piece of merchandise for the show that I'm aware of, a DS game, which I just so happen to own a sealed copy of. Well, it was sealed. Heh, just try and stop me. And yeah, after watching it, it really didn't tell me anything particularly interesting. The most we got was that Nelvana, or whatever the fuck, was a Canadian production company that was offering employees the chance to pitch their own ideas for animated TV shows. And Greg Collinson, the creator of the show, had a sudden burst of inspiration based on the idea of the 8 sigils. It's actually kind of interesting to get his perspective because the reason why he chose dice as the main visual focal point was his fascination with the concept of dice and the random nature of it. From this, the entire show blossomed, and that is fascinating. He didn't mention any specific shows or specific concepts other than that, so it's entirely possible that this was a wholly original concept. But yeah, otherwise nothing that you wouldn't learn from reading the Wikipedia article. And the rest of the making of documentary is just the animation process, and it's worth seeing just to have an understanding for how extensive and complicated it is to bring an animated show to life. There is a lot to go into it, and textbooks upon textbooks worth of writing. But regardless of the inspirations, it doesn't matter as long as Di-Gata Defenders is good, and personally I think Di-Gata Defenders is a very mixed bag. I'm not going to say the show is bad, far from it, but there were definitely some creative decisions that held the show back.
Yeah, well, it sounds bad when you put it like that.
Such as the action. Like I said, everyone has mastery over a few of the sigils, and those sigils are contained in stones. So the fighting consists of tossing stones to summon attacks, so most of the action scenes just evolve into characters standing on opposite ends of a battlefield, casting magic. A lot of which utilize reused animations. In fact, let's call it what it is, it's battle Yahtzee. That phrase entered my mind at one point, and now I've been chuckling about it ever since. They're throwing dice at each other to do attacks, it's battle Yahtzee. Aside from being a somewhat disinteresting way to show action, there's also no set parameters. I mean, the main characters have a general set of go-to attacks that they'll often use, but because they have the freedom to combine endless combinations of the 8 sigils, in a lot of cases, they don't establish what the various combinations will do until they're shown. And if the audience isn't aware of the potential of what attacks may be coming, it's harder to get invested in the action because it feels like they can just pull something completely out of their ass at a moment's notice. It's like if you write yourself into a corner, you can just arbitrarily throw out a combination of stones that the audience has never seen cast before and have that combination arbitrarily do the exact thing that will get you out of the situation. Whereas if you have set parameters, spoken or implied, it doesn't make the combat feel like a series of ass pulls. Things do come alive quite a bit when the Guardians get involved, and there are some more impressive action scenes later into the season with hand-to-hand combat and more impressive visuals that I like, but there is at least a significant chunk of the combat which is just casting spells at each other like LARPers who are way too into it. I'm assuming this was a budget thing, but that's still really unfortunate because this is primarily an action show. However, there are a lot of things that don't eat at a budget that this show could have used, such as better writing and consistency, but I suppose we'll get into that as we go. Now, when you first start watching episode 1, the first thing you'll notice is the rather interesting art style. I don't exactly know what they were going for. It's sort of a pseudo 2D attempt to look 3D, which is especially apparent whenever the characters look forward. They attempt to try and convey the facial features using just the shadows, but it really doesn't work. It just looks really uncanny a lot of the time, so that whenever characters are facing forward, they all have Voldemort's facial structure. It's a unique art style for sure, and it's not too distracting, but I would have preferred a more traditional art style. I mean, characters like one of the main antagonists, Brachus, has a malformed nose which is visible from all angles, and that looked fine. Sometimes trying to be unique for the sake of being unique is a bit of a fool's errand. Another thing you'll notice when you begin watching episode 1, which is something I actually completely forgot, is just how funny the show is at times.
Hit me, Kara. Extra crispy.
Coming right up.
Like, I was watching the opening scene with all 4 of the characters interacting for the first time on screen, and there were multiple laugh-out-loud moments that convey the personalities of each character.
I'm just trying to avert a potential disaster.
And the characterization is tightly done. Eric is an insomniac nerd who gets so invested in his projects that he pulls an all-nighter without even realizing it. That's a mood. Meanwhile, he questions why Kara was up so late, which establishes his overbearing older brotherly nature, while Kara gives Eric shit like only a little sister can. Seth then wakes up and immediately eats an entire feast because one of his primary characteristics is eating like an army, and Mel is also there. And their attempts at showcasing the personalities continue through until the inciting incident. Mel and Seth have a sparring session, and when it comes to combat in this show, at least at first, the more shield stones you cast, the more shields you have, but the less powerful your attacks are. So Seth, as an act of arrogance, only puts up one shield. We're also properly introduced to both Seth's and Mel's guardians. Seth's being a rock monster named Kragus, who will become much more important as the season goes on, and even before peak importance constantly saves Seth's ass, and Dracor, who's an ice dragon. Meanwhile, Eric and Kara are studying, and their dynamic is continued to be established when Eric freaks out at the sight of a spider while Kara no-sells it, and even acts mildly curious. Eric also accidentally destroys the library, showing his clumsy nature. Truth be told, it's probably a good thing the dojo immediately gets destroyed after this. It's all good stuff that gives you a tight and concise summary of the personalities just in time for their paradise to be ripped to shreds. But despite the qualities, episode 1 establishes one of the main issues with the show in that the power scaling is fucked. No joke, the first enemy they encounter is this giant serpent thing, which they seemingly can't damage whatsoever. They only manage to defeat it by using the Warrior Henge attack, which is their ultimate final limit break attack that drains them of all energy. So this is literally episode 1, and we've already established that basic attacks don't do anything to more powerful enemies. So for any fight after this, I'm wondering why they even bother with basic attacks and why they don't just break out the limit break attack anytime they encounter an enemy rather than waste their time. Further breaking the power scaling, Seth is gifted a stone called the Nova Stone in episode 1, which belonged to his father. It's a champion stone and is basically a handheld tactical nuke, and you want to know when they break it out for the first time? Episode 3, when the Warrior Henge attack is established to not work on one of the tertiary antagonists. So Seth has to use the nuclear option, and the only escalation they have left is the fact that it's too powerful for him and he needs to become more skilled before he can use it to its full potential. Either way, from episode 1, there's very little upward mobility. What's funny is, they combine different attacks which actually does damage, briefly, and that's what the combat should have been based around, combining different elemental attacks to maximize damage. Isn't that the point of being trained in different disciplines? Like, sure it happens, but it's rarely of any consequence. The tertiary antagonist who tanks the Nova Stone is named Malco. Malco is a man who is basically brain dead, but is also pure brute strength. He had his shield stones grafted to his skin, making him nigh indestructible, which is ironic because after his introduction, the concept of casting shield stones at the start of a fight gradually fades away. Well, sort of. In the first few episodes, you saw the defenders cast the shield stones, and after that, they do still sometimes have shields present, but I don't think they actually cast their shield stones until the finale. And it's a shame because that whole cast the power thing is a good signifier of the action starting.
Cast the power!
And also, it was a potentially marketable catchphrase akin to "gotta catch 'em all." There are other instances where that phrase comes up, but only like 2 or 3 times in the rest of the season. But I digress. In wrestling terms, Malco is a heavy, which means he's a large sidekick. Who's he a heavy to? Well, he's a heavy to flinch, and I could go on explaining this guy's personality, but I'll just sum it up like this. He's basically just Cortex from Crash Bandicoot, a comedically bumbling mad scientist who's only occasionally shown to be competent.
No, can't you paddle this thing any faster, you big oaf? Row, I say! Row!
They're the field agents sent out to try and subdue the defenders, as well as do whatever secondary objective the Order of Infinitus needs them to do at that particular moment. But they're usually thwarted, and their dynamic is actually a very compelling dynamic in the sense that Malco plays the straight man to Flinch's utter incompetence. These two characters are ordered around by the aforementioned Brachus, a guy with a crooked nose, a scar, and a Hulk Hogan-level skullet. And a really cool name. Matter of fact, I resent this show for using the name Brachus because it means that I can never use that name in any of my fictional works without it being unintentionally a reference to him. A lot of the time he's just generically evil without a ton of distinguishing humanity or personality, but he's presented with enough gravitas that it works.
Malco and Flinch think they can make a move without my knowledge? Ha! Those idiots!
Especially when he's being used to juxtapose against the more silly characters, although he's not what I would consider the primary antagonist, in what is meant as a semi-dramatically ironic twist in the sense that Brachus and the audience are the only ones who are aware of it at first. Lord Nazmul is still alive and is still pulling the strings behind the scenes, which is a big reveal to both the Defenders as well as Malco and Flinch in episode 13.
The Dakanauts have been rebuilt. It can only mean one thing. Nazmul! He's alive!
Which is a well-presented plot point, but then Nazmul just starts showing up willy-nilly as if he wasn't just a mysterious figure 24 hours previous. Whatever. So the first arc is only 3 episodes long, where they have to get to this monastery to retrieve a map that will lead them to the Pure Stones, a monastery filled with odd-looking people. Is this person even humanoid? And boy, that character design, wow. With episode 1 being the introduction and episode 3 being basically all action, episode 2 was left with the thankless task of getting from A to B, introducing some lore and also introducing Adam, as well as his story arcs of being a bit on the sketchy side and having a crush on Mel. This episode is definitely more on the shaky side because of the really cringeworthy interpersonal conflict they shoehorn into this episode.
I don't believe it! You tricked me!
I can explain.
Seth was right about you. You're nothing but trouble.
Is that right?
In fact, that's kind of been the biggest revelation going back to this show after so many years, is just how cringeworthy some of these episodes can be with a fresh adult mindset. It's definitely the type of thing that I would have overlooked or not been conscious of all those years back, but I'm extremely intolerant to that sort of thing these days. So I was finding myself skipping 30 seconds ahead every now and again. With that said, by the time they get to the monastery, it's already under attack, and so this entire episode is a series of action set pieces which are generally fine. The Order ends up destroying the map, but it's a fake, and the priestess has the real one. And that kicks off the adventure proper. This segment of episodes was originally presented as a 3-episode block of programming, and it's definitely the best way this is experienced because it does feel like a 3-part story rather than individual segments. I mean, the ending of episode 3 has a prime example of ending an entire story segment with an oh shit moment. I feel like as a means to establish the characters and the lore of the show, and as a sampling of what to expect, it does a pretty damn good job. It's nice and succinct, very little screen time is wasted. I would say these 3 episodes are basically the make or break for viewer interest. If you're into the show by the end of episode 3 with everything taken as a whole, flaws and strengths included, you'll probably at least get a kick out of the rest of the season. It's not the best the series has to offer, but it's enough of the good and enough of the bad that you'll know if you can tolerate the lows to get to the highs. But if you're not digging it by that point, then you might as well quit. Following this, we enter a series of episodes specifically designed as Adventure of the Week episodes, a lot of which are done specifically for character and world building while they gear themselves up to kickstart the main overarching plot. I mean, that's the thing, this is actually a very rare syndicated show before streaming, but only the second half of the first season onwards is fully syndicated. In the first half, with a few exceptions, you can basically watch in any order and not much would really change. Matter of fact, some of these episodes would actually do with you watching them out of order because of how inconsistent the locations are, because in sequential episodes they find themselves in seemingly random locations with no connectivity. In episode 9, they're in a mountainous region. In episode 10, they're in a desert, and in episode 11, they're back in a mountainous region. What is the geographical layout of Rados? Now, some of the episodes in this sequence are actually really good. Episode 4, for example, Snared, is one of the more solid outings in the season. In this episode, the gang along with Adam are traveling along in their speeder bikes, but then Adam and Seth get into a dick measuring contest that results in Seth winning bragging rights but also breaks his speeder bike. Yeah, apparently they got the speeder bikes from the monastery in the previous episode, which is as good of an explanation as any for why they're able to travel large distances in a short amount of time, but I wonder what the monks were doing with them before this. I just have this image in my head of this guy pulling off sick drifts to impress the honeys. Also, the speeder bikes represent one of the more confusing things about the show because while this is mostly a medieval fantasy show, it has sci-fi elements like this, which makes the overall presentation a bit of a mishmash. But anyways, while Eric picks up the slack to fix the speeder bike, for he is secretly the most important character in the show, Seth and Adam decide to settle their differences with a little mano-y-mano battle, which determines whether or not Adam can stick around. It's also when we find out that Adam's guardian is called Firefox. No joke.
Firefox, ignite!
In fairness, when this episode premiered, Firefox, the browser, was only 2 years old, so it probably wasn't that well known. Meanwhile, the rest of the gang is ambushed by a bounty hunter called Snare, arch-enemy of Lars Ulrich, but tis. It's a good episode for character building, and it has 2 pretty decent action scenes. Also, this one visual always cracks me up for some reason. Though this is a minor example of a problem that will become more prominent later, the inability to fully capitalize on their ideas. It's established that Seth and Adam were running out of energy going into the fight with Snare, who I keep accidentally thinking is named Snatch, but that's a different thing.
And I'm low on Di-Gata energy. You?
Very low.
And yet it's still a completely even fight until they arbitrarily run out of energy. It's like, dang, out of energy, out of nowhere. At which point there's a Deus Ex Machina, and one that's so obvious you wonder why it wasn't the first thing they did. They eventually paid off them being low on energy, but like I said, it's a minor example of this issue. Also, as with most masked characters in media, they build up what this guy looks like under the mask, and then...
Whoa, now that's ugly.
Yeah, it's funny, they go out of their way to tell you how ugly this guy is, and yet he's not actually that bad looking. I mean, Christ, if this show was more popular, he'd probably have a pretty dedicated fan club on DeviantArt. Either way, it's a solid episode, and the way that Adam and Seth gain a begrudging respect for each other by the end is kinda nice, and the overall drama, pacing, and structuring of the episode is quite well done. Then you have the episode with the traveling circus.
Seth! Ah! The giant squirrels are coming! Everybody run!
Cringe.
Basically, Eric builds an upgrade to his gauntlet that gives him a temporary burst of super strength, though the mechanics of which aren't well established and probably make no sense scientifically. Well anyways, using the super strength, Eric saves the traveling circus and then becomes an honorary member. But it turns out that the circus folk are being mind-controlled by the ringleader, this psychic woman named Madame Lizelle. Although there is more to it than that, obviously. Also, Madame Lizelle somehow becomes a recurring character. While he's possessed, they make a big deal out of not hurting Eric, so Seth decides to knock down his pants, which is funny, don't get me wrong, but it also doesn't incapacitate him in any way, so it ends up being a joke for the sake of being a joke. The funniest part to me is the fact that he's mind-controlled for a few minutes after his pants are knocked down, but he never bothers to pick them up. It all culminates with what could have been a great joke, but it's ruined by wordiness. No, seriously, I can recut this joke and make it twice as funny.
Seth? Kara? My pants!
In the great words of William Shakespeare, brevity is the soul of wit, and if you're able to get the same point across in as few words as possible, it's guaranteed to be more funny. And one last thing about this episode. Canada has a decent selection of voice actors, but not so vast that you don't get a lot of crossover, hence the character Finn.
I lived with my dad on a farm in Olgar. I can't wait to get back to see him.
That's Stacy DePaw. DePaw? I don't know. And I cannot hear that name without hearing Nikki from 16, and no, you are never getting a retrospective on that show. I would literally rather die. Then there's such episodes as The Town That Time Forgot, where the defenders are running low on supplies and patience given the fact that the quest hasn't yielded any results. Which makes sense, especially if you're a teenager. If you're expected to save the world, you'd want some recognition, but they're actually worse off now on the quest than they were back home. Speaking of teenagers though, that brings me to something I wanted to discuss. So, how old do you think these characters are? Particularly Mel, Eric, and Seth. Eric is a beefcake, but you know he might be big for his age. Meanwhile, Seth is a little bit more slight in his build, but that just might be how he's built. Meanwhile, there's Mel, who looks, quite physically developed. Yeah, let's go with that. So how old do you think they are? The answer is 14 years old. Yeah, I call bullshit on that. No 14-year-old alive looks like this. So what gives? The only one who looks 14 is Kara, and even that's a bit of a stretch. I knew girls in high school who looked like this at 16. But even though she could reasonably be 14, they establish her as the youngest of the crew at 12.
Man, that cute kid routine really works.
Gets him every time.
And as for the rest of them, I'd say that Eric and Mel look between 18 and 20, while Seth maybe looks a year or two younger. Point is, they look way older than they should. I think that was maybe their intention at first, but I have a sneaking suspicion that the studio mandated that they be established as younger because the core audience were kids between ages 10 and 12. So they would want the characters to be old enough to be aspirational, while not being so old that they're unrelatable to the audience. But 14 or not, when the defenders are at their lowest, they stumble across a town that has a bandit problem, and the bandits have been pinning the thefts on the defenders. So now they have to save this town that hates them and learn that a good deed is not worth doing because you benefit from it, it's worth doing because it's the right thing to do. It's a simple A to B plot that works and has a really clever resolution. Plus, Adam's involvement as the inside man who saves their asses multiple times is another example to add to the list of really riveting plots driven by him. Or then there's the episode Vitus, the episode where they discover a mine where the elusive ninth sigil rests. The best part of this episode is that it's where Kara's boots start to malfunction due to the contents of the mine they're in causing interference, which puts the chip on her shoulder over the idea that she's being babied into overdrive, and it's where we get the first steps into her becoming a separate entity from her brother. Though even then, they can't get through the episode without some weird writing quirks. Kara's instructed to sit out because without her boots working properly, she's a liability, but then she randomly decides,
Unless I can fix them. And Eric thinks he's the only genius in the family.
and they never specify what that fix is. You can't just brush that aside. The malfunctioning boots are kind of vital to the episode's plotting. When I'm begging for meaningless technobabble, it's not exactly a good sign, and wouldn't you know it, the solution doesn't last. Still, it's a good episode for the progression of the lore. It also plays into a later episode where Seth has to exchange the Nova Stone to create a stone with the ninth sigil, and he ends up using it as a Deus Ex Machina when Lord Nazmul's robot army attacks. I know that's a lot of plot to summarize without talking about it, but I want to get this video done at some point today. But like I said, this chunk of episodes also has some of the worst episodes in the series, such as the flaw in the ointment. And a flaw there certainly is. It's a weird episode where an entire village is being corrupted by a champion stone broadcasting what amounts to a false reality, making everyone happy and zoned out, as well as making the world around them look better than it actually is. I think this episode is a ham-fisted metaphor for drug use, but it's a really boring episode with a slow pace and a weak conclusion. Then you have this episode called Castaways. Okay, so get this. The team has to cross a vast body of water. So they have to sneak aboard this ship they paid to carry their speeder bikes, all because the boat didn't have a passenger permit. But couldn't you, find another boat with a passenger permit? Doesn't matter, the captain is fine with it once they're discovered. This episode is interesting for the fact that it establishes that their stones don't work if they're not over land, because their stones get their power from the earth below them, but I don't think that ever comes up again, so it's kind of a pointless establishment. And then there's the main plot, which is whack. The ship is carrying a bunch of material called dacasite, which they claim is going to be used to build an orphanage, but it's also established that the same material is used to build weapons. Then it's later established that the cargo was stolen from another person. This chick. The plot twist is so obvious it's practically punching you in the face, and yet they still decide that the people who stole the cargo were actually going to build an orphanage with it, despite that being the most cliched thing ever. Why would you even establish that it's used for weapons if you weren't going to have the bad guy use it for weapons? It's like you just took Chekhov's gun and threw it out the window. I wonder if that was a producer or studio mandate, because there's obviously a lot of things that were altered in production to try and make this safe for the audience. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were intending to go the obvious route before the producers or whoever came down on them. But even beyond potential producer interference, there were some things that could have been improved. Like there's this absolutely stupid ass moment where they're thrown overboard and then Kara, who's not able to swim, just kind of faints and sinks like a stone. Yeah, that's not how drowning works. You're usually still conscious while you're sinking. It was also established that she couldn't swim in the most contrived way. At the beginning of the episode, when Eric almost falls into the water on accident, she assures him that he can't swim, but it's not like he wanted to swim. It was an accident that he almost fell in. It's a line put in specifically so they can get to this exchange.
Eric! You know you can't swim.
Yeah? Well, neither can you.
Don't remind me.
It kind of brings up the issue of the moment-to-moment writing being a bit clunky. Like, usually the dialogue is fine, but then other times it's written in a very unreal way, as if it's just subtly off for reasons you can't quite describe, but your brain notices the unreality of it. In how some lines are worded in a way that nobody would ever word them. And when you notice it, it's pretty jarring.
Foolish girl, you have barnacles for a brain if you believe any of the lies that blowfish Calico is so fond of spinning.
Why do you talk that way?
But is that really a fair criticism, given that I'm an adult going back to this show? Maybe not, but then again, things like TMNT 2003 managed to have relatively authentic dialogue while still providing exposition and personality, etc. But then again, that was an American show, so maybe that's the common denominator. Incidentally, I also burst out laughing for this moment.
Rivet Flash!
Rivet Flash. Yeah, I think I saw that on r/Ratchet and Clank. Is there anything I really like about this episode? Well, I think the one thing that I will say without a shadow of a doubt was very fun is Malco and Flinch in a rowboat, because they're trying to catch up to the defenders, but every time it cuts to them, it's pretty hilarious. The episode I remembered being the worst wasn't actually as bad as I remembered. Episode 7, Escape from Ogama Gore. It's this episode where there's this guy who looks like this guy from Ren and Stimpy, who is kidnapping a bunch of people and converting them to energy stones, which will in some way I'm not clear on, help Brachus usurp Nazmul.
The Daco energy will feed back into itself, creating a Daco super vortex, a weapon of immense power.
Oh, I guess that's how. Man, was I so bored by this episode I completely forgot that detail? That's pretty much the only reason that this episode exists, to establish that Brachus is undermining Nazmul to try and take over the Order of Infinis. This episode is definitely skippable to a certain extent, but it's not nearly as flawed as other episodes in this string of episodes. Although it is the first instance of yet another recurring issue, the weird censorship. I'm assuming the producers didn't like the word kill, despite the fact that this is a show where that word would have had to come up a lot. So instead, they use the word destroy in its place.
Since Nazmul was destroyed, the Order has fallen under mismanagement, if you will.
It's such an unwieldy word, and fits about as smooth and naturally into the dialogue as a swordfish into a urethra. It's a drinking game with this show to see how many ways they can get around having to say the word kill. Destroy, vaporize, eliminate, etc. To the point where I was actually shocked in the odd occasion when they said kill or die.
But then Brachus tells me that it could kill the host, so I'm like, whoa, hold on, kill? That's not good.
It's such an arbitrary bit of censorship, and it's never not been utterly idiotic. You may say this is something that only a fresh adult mind would see, but no. This is actually something that has always bugged me. Literally always. After 20 years, I forgot almost everything about this show, but I always remembered this. And while I don't hate this episode nearly as much as I remembered, the worst thing about this episode is that it throws away a potentially interesting character dynamic. This is Snare's second appearance, and he and the gang are captured, so him and Seth have to work together. There were a few humorous moments, but this guy is barely established as a character, and we're already subverting the character dynamics. This could have meant something if he was more established as a character, but ultimately it ends up meaning nothing because the subversion only works if you're subverting something that the audience has gotten used to. Yet another example of the writing not being able to fully capitalize on the ideas. Also, Snare gets jobbed out big time at the end of the episode by V-Moth, Kara's guardian. I was gonna complain, but then again, given how absolutely ass the power scaling is, at the very least it's heartening to know there's one character who's ineffectual in direct combat. So why didn't I hate this episode as much as I thought? Well, I guess the drama is mildly interesting, and the through line of dealing with Kara's guardian going missing gives the episode some personal stakes, so it's not terrible, but it's not great. Then of course there's the final episode of this string of episodes where they encounter this native tribe and Eric saves one of the high-ranking member's daughters, which makes the high-ranking member angry because Eric showed him up. The petty little bitch. It makes way for a lot of weird, contrived conflict, but then in the end, saving the village leads them to the first Pure Stone, and finally, after 13 episodes, we finally get to the actual plot of the season. They find themselves separated in a psychedelic maze where everyone is faced with their own challenges, but it's Mel who finds the first Pure Stone, which puts her into a coma as a result, overcome by Megalith's power, which is corrupting the Pure Stone, which is ironic, given the name. Also, holy crap, I'm getting Shinji Ikari vibes here. Following this is without hyperbole the absolute best episode in the first 2/3 of the season, Doom Chase. Mel is out cold, so somebody has to stay behind to take care of her. Seth goes ahead alone because he gets wind of this guy Doku, a former high-ranking member of the Order of Infinite who was usurped by Brachus. He strikes a deal with Seth, who gives Seth vital information that will lead him to the map that was stolen in exchange for taking out Brachus. Yeah, I didn't really mention it, but the map they got in episode 3 was stolen. Although it turns out that Kara also went ahead to find Seth, got captured, and to ensure Seth's loyalty, Doku poisons her. But then it turns out that he lied about having the antidote. So the entire episode is this espionage story where Seth infiltrates a stronghold to literally assassinate a guy to save a friend without knowing she'll end up dying anyway if he goes through with it. Meanwhile, Kara escapes to try and warn Seth, but she's also dying, which gives this episode a dramatic ticking clock element. The action's great, the drama is fantastic, it even has a few cute comedic moments as well. Yeah, as it turns out, every Guardian has a small form as well as a large form. And just look at Tiny Kragus. I just want to pinch his non-existent cheeks. But thankfully, these moments don't break the tone. There are a few key flaws with this episode, the first and biggest of which is this moment.
Your parents. There is a way to be reunited with them. It can be done.
My parents! You can do that? But how?
So Seth has the upper hand and he lets his guard down because of the promise of seeing his parents again. If I was less kind, I would say this is character assassination because this is a tacit admission that he's prioritizing the dead over the very much alive but dying. As far as he knows at this moment, this guy still needs to die for Kara to survive, and it only happens because they needed a way for Seth to lose the upper hand. It would have been a lot better if Brachus was begging for his life, but then Kara yells at Seth from off screen that Doku lied, and that distracts Seth for just long enough for Brachus to get the upper hand back. But I'm gonna forgive this because this episode goes hard. The second issue is that Mel and Eric don't do anything. That's not an exaggeration. It occasionally cuts back to them to remind you they exist, otherwise nada. Third of all, and this is gonna be a long ramble, so strap in. The most confusing thing about Kara trying to prove herself and gain a level of independence from her brother despite being the youngest in the crew is that they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They still wanted that younger sister, older brother dynamic to exist in the show, so after Kara ostensibly proves herself capable of taking care of herself, she then latches onto Seth, who then treats her basically the same as Eric did. So all she did is exchange one older brother figure for another. Though her character is a bit stop and start, as she complains about being smothered in one episode and then seeks comfort in Eric in the next episode. But then again, children are bundles of emotion that don't really make much sense, so I can accept that. But I can't accept the inconsistency. This is more of a structural flaw with the second half of the season, but this is where it really presents itself, with Seth being paired up with Kara, having to save her, and having to take care of her in the next episode. This means that in a lot of cases, Seth is more concerned about Kara's well-being than her own brother, even at times when Eric is right there and logically should be the one stepping in. I guess what they were going for here is that these two characters have the most fleshed out personalities, so you want to pair them up together, but it's still incongruous with her overall character arc. Not only that, but it also takes away one of the core pillars of Eric's character, which in turn gives Seth too much to do, because from a very early point they were teasing a romantic interest between him and Mel, but there's simply not enough screen time for him to play the big brother to Kara, and the uneasy ally to Adam, and the potential love interest to Mel, and have it all be fleshed out. Hence why the potential love interest storyline never feels particularly fleshed out. Plus, it never gets paid off. Literally ever. So basically, Eric and Mel are sacrificed on the altar of the other two, which is why they really should have honestly paired up Mel and Eric as a means to develop their characters off each other. If Mel had woken up sooner, you could have had an entire episode's worth of character building between them. That might even result in Mel having more personality than a cold fish. If you were able to juxtapose the action of the A story with the character building of the B story, it could have turned a great episode into a perfect episode. Still, Doom Chase is otherwise a superb episode. Unfortunately, it's not followed up well. In the following episode, it's Mel and Eric's turn to kick some ass, while Seth and Kara sit on the sidelines. This time, they're in a tournament for what is ostensibly a Pure Stone. They pay off the Kara being poisoned plotline in the worst way possible. So Kara and Seth both escaped through a teleportation portal, but then the portal gets hit by an attack which randomizes the destination. Where do they end up? Exactly where they need to be to find the antidote right as she's about to die. I'm sorry, no. That is a coincidence too far in my book. If they would have extended the amount of time the poison would take to kill her to maybe 12 or even 24 hours, they could have milked this for the entire episode and paid it off in a less contrived way, such as they get teleported within a relatively decent distance of where they need to go, but still not close enough to get where they need to go on foot, so maybe they have to get some help from someone local, maybe a returning character, maybe a new character who has some sort of connection with the previous generation of defenders. Literally anything other than what they did would be preferable, because once it's all said and done, like Mel and Eric in the previous episode, they don't do anything of substance until they show up at the end of the episode to make the save, ruining potentially good drama. Are you starting to see what I mean about the show having subpar writing and not being able to pay off their plot lines properly? It has a lot of good ideas, but the execution is seemingly always flawed. And then there's Seth's speech at the end of the episode, which just showcases how much of a lack of bite the dialogue carries a lot of the time.
You should fight for a reason, like helping people and making Rado safe. We're the Di-Gata defenders, and that's what we fight for.
Like, there's no bite to the things he's saying, and he constantly brings up the "we're Di-Gata defenders" point as if that's some sort of inspirational talking point. There were a million ways to punch up the dialogue here to make it hit harder and also make it make more sense that these people would immediately turn face. I really wanted to like this episode, but all it really does is showcase the inability for the writers to commit to their ideas. Either way, they're now reunited, the drama surrounding the first Pure Stone is over and done with, and now we're full steam ahead for the rest of the season. Unfortunately, we only have 11 episodes left. Yeah, they wasted 3/5 of the season on a single MacGuffin, and now the other 3 are gonna have to be sorted out in the next 11 episodes. Do they have time for that? Surprisingly, yeah. And honestly, as much as it pains me to say it, I actually think the final stretch of the season actually gets kind of really good. Okay, well that shouldn't come without qualification. The last 10 episodes still suffer from the same issues the rest of the season suffers from, and there are still some episodes that range from boring to straight up questionable. In the former camp, we have the likes of Den of Thieves, an utterly inconsequential episode that is in firm contention for the most skippable episode in the season. By the end of the episode, nothing of consequence has happened, and they end up right back where they started. I suspect this episode was made so that they could save on the animation budget by covering everyone's mouths. Then in the category of questionable episodes, you have Nexus. Now, first of all, the concept of a nexus has been in multiple shows and various other media that I grew up with. This, Charmed, Freddy Fish, and also wrestling. Matter of fact, every time they mentioned the Nexus, I was tempted to burst into song.
What's the Nexus?
We walk alone in the unknown.
But I've never actually looked up what a Nexus is. Turns out it's a series of connecting links. Wow, for something that sounds so mysterious, that is a really benign definition. Now, why is this episode questionable? Oh, you'll see. The framing device is that ever since Mel was corrupted by the megalith energy when she first touched the Pure Stone, she's been having wizard attacks, basically violent energy discharges. Also, that wizard thing, yeah, keep that in the back of your mind. Meanwhile, Kara still has a bit of poison in her from before, so they need to get to a place called the Nexus to heal. They're guided by this guy Rayald, allegedly a lost defender, but it's said that he died a few years previous, but the Silver Tongue wins them over, despite the fact that it's actually a shape-shifting reptilian woman named Kaylee? And, okay, wow. So when things start to get uncomfortable is, well, Callie or whatever the fuck her name is, disguised as Rayald, is attempting to capture Kara for reasons I'll get into in a bit. And the way it's presented can only be described as... I mean, look at this.
It's just... I'm afraid.
You must cast your fears aside, Kara. You must believe in yourself.
Bad touch, stranger danger.
Maybe I'm reading too deep into things. This definitely wasn't the intention, either in universe or out of universe. But it's hard not to get those vibes, you know? Like, goddamn. The rest of the episode is fine, but this one aspect just feels so uncomfortable. But those are the worst of it, and if I'm being honest, as these episodes go on, the endemic issues seem less noticeable, and when the drama ramps up, there's actually some really good stuff here. For example, while they still have to abide by certain parameters, they still have some pretty disturbing things happen. Such as the moment where Eric almost dies because he has all the water sucked out of his body. That's pretty disturbing. Or this moment where an entire army rolls in and starts firing upon these innocent villagers with the intent of killing each and every single one of them. Or there's this entire plot line about how Malco and Flinch are fully aware of Brachus and Nazmul both secretly undermining each other, and they have to play both sides in order to survive, which makes for some really interesting drama. The absolute peak story arc for this chunk of the show would definitely be the Kragus storyline. Throughout the series, the Guardians are more or less treated as more than just Guardians. They're like beloved pets. Pets that have to fight to the death every other day, but pets nonetheless. But either way, they establish a bond between the Guardians and the Masters, especially Kragus, the rock monster who's almost respected as one of the team and saves Seth's ass multiple times. While Kara and Eric are off saving the realm from a rampaging B-plot, Mel and Seth go to this place called the Pinnacle to help cure Mel of her wizard attacks. In the process, Seth comes across his father's guardian, Omniaxor, who's like if Red Hulk really let himself go and also replaced his feet with cloven hooves. Also, uniquely among the Guardians in the show, aside from having a name that sounds straight out of Ben 10, Omniaxor is actually not just sentient, but he's intelligent. He's able to speak and has full conversations with the team.
You dare summon me? Why am I here?
He's an actual character, but that doesn't mean he's not above making mistakes. While Mel is in the depths of the Pinnacle curing herself, we find out that Omniaxor is so powerful that he straight up murders Kragus. Like, straight up murder. He does not come back. And it's actually presented with a surprising amount of weight. Seth blames himself and starts bottling up his emotions, but through a combination of grief as well as a newfound power, he becomes far more angry and aggressive over the following episodes. And what really sells this is the episode immediately after the death of Kragus, where we get flashbacks to when Seth first met him. He's immediately dismissive, but falls in love just as fast when Kragus shows his playful yet shit-disturbing personality.
Whoa! Hey! Give that back! Oh!
Besides, who couldn't love this thing? I would love a tiny Kragus plush. It's a charming scene that is juxtaposed tragically with the knowledge that he's now gone. It hits especially hard if you've ever lost a beloved pet. This whole storyline is presented impeccably. Seriously, imagine that. A character died and they treat it with a level of gravitas. If you know, you know. Though Kragus isn't fully gone, while Kragus was being shattered, multiple shards actually fuse with Seth, meaning that they become one and the same. Something he finally realizes a couple of episodes later when he gets an acid burn on his shirt and realizes, wait a minute, I'm made of stone. Which brings up questions about how often these people change their clothes or bathe. They must smell like they felched a septic tank. Though that's just the beginning. Later on, the fusing manifests in a very monstrous way, and it makes for some good drama. People are afraid of Seth, he can't go into any of the dojos, he goes off on Omniaxor, who actually feels remorse for what happened.
You must believe me, it was an accident.
An accident? An accident like my father being destroyed?
Your father's destruction is a heavy weight on my soul.
And Seth ends up quitting the team as a result of his monstrous nature, but then Omniaxor teams up with a little girl who has some sort of distorted energy vision to convince Seth to come back. And when Seth is given the option to eat a specific raw ore that would separate him from Kragus, he chooses not to because he doesn't want to lose him again. Like, yeah, that's a totally valid and logical reason. I mean, it helps that once he fuses with Kragus, he has super strength that functionally helps them so that they have some brute strength that doesn't rely on Di-Gata energy. Although, if we're being honest, they really should have been trained in physical combat as well as stone casting. I mean, there are multiple times where they run out of energy and are sitting ducks. Shouldn't their professor have trained them in sword combat or something for such a scenario? Or screw that, we know energy guns and stuff exists in this universe. Why not train them in that? If there's one issue I have with this plotline, it's the fact that when Seth is speaking normally, he sounds natural.
It took everything we had and it didn't even slow down.
When he does the Kragus yell, it sounds natural because that's a pre-recorded sound effect. But in the rare occasion when Seth tries to sound more menacing, even though it's not very often, it sounds very forced.
You can't help me! Look at me! Ah!
I think at that point, they really should have either gotten a different voice actor or somehow made all of his monstrous voice lines Kragus-based. And that pretty much leaves us with nothing to talk about but the final few episodes. But to do that, we also need to discuss the other main plot of the season. Aside from getting the Pure Stones to stop the megalith, after it's revealed that Nazmul is still alive, it's established that his body is rapidly deteriorating and he needs a new host. And for the sake of his machinations, he wants a powerful host so that he can achieve immortality. Initially, his desire is to have Mel as his next vessel because she's a descendant of the Wizards of Yan, some important clan that we don't know much about. They're an ancient wizard clan, so draw your own conclusions, but she descends from them, therefore she has mystic abilities that the rest of the team doesn't. They teased this early on, but by episode 11 it's laid bare.
I'm a wizard.
You're a what?
Wait a minute. Is that referencing what I think it's referencing?
I'm a wizard.
You're a what?
A wizard. And a thumping good, I'd wager.
This was obviously intended as her primary story arc, however, about halfway through the season they switch gears and establish apropos of nothing that Kara is actually the one that has the most pure magical potential. For reasons. It's sort of teased occasionally, like when she's able to invade Mel's coma. Apparently she's a natural conduit for Di-Gata energy, and as such, using her as a vessel could amplify Nazmul's power. And Nazmul just kinda goes along with the switching of gears without a second thought.
I chose the young one. She has infinite potential, more powerful than the others.
Excellent.
I guess he's just taking her word for it. But then again, Kara's a little disabled girl in a cartoon. I'd be more surprised if she wasn't secretly the most powerful of the team. But this was the final death nail for Mel's character and why she ended up having no personality whatsoever. Her major plot line was given to someone else, so that by episode 18, when they do switch gears, Mel is nothing more than a fourth wheel on the team. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still feel like the storyline of Nazmul taking over a host is a good storyline, even a great storyline. It's just unfortunate that they sacrificed a potentially good character when they switched gears, but for what it's worth, the storyline still works really well with Kara in the driver's seat instead. This culminates with the last few episodes, and I would say from about episode 22 onward, they really loosen up the restrictions. You start to see some really good and quite brutal action scenes, including Nazmul being dismembered and dripping green fluid in a way that looks like he's bleeding. Brutal while still technically being child-friendly. You get heightened drama, plot twist on top of plot twist, and just a lot of cool things happening. Oh, and people start dying. Like, a lot. Pretty brutally too. Unfortunately though, most if not all these deaths are retconned in the second season. I think the only character who stayed dead was Sari, that's S-A-R-I, and that was a character introduced for all of one episode and had a plot twist reveal of being evil so poorly handled I wasn't even sure that was the direction they were going until someone yelled out, "Hey, you're evil!"
I carved the Nova Stone with Nazmul, and he would like to say goodbye.
Why are you doing this? Nazmul will burn the entire realm to cinders. He's insane.
But even still, at first I was kind of holding my nose through some of these episodes, but by the time of the last couple episodes, I was eagerly anticipating what came next. Even though I sort of remembered what happened. And one of the things that this chunk of episodes really mastered is the art of the cold open. Something they started doing well around episode 16, but started doing exceptionally well within the last few episodes. With only 22 minutes of runtime, you need to kick the plot into gear. So they started to kickstart the plots immediately by giving the watchers a bunch of questions and then gradually sprinkling in the answers as the episodes went on. So like in this one episode, immediately after they decide they're going to attack Nazmul's keep, the episode literally opens up with Adam showing up at Brachus' hideout with the 3 pure stones that the defenders had and Kara. We then learn that Adam is Brachus' child. Like, what the hell? We even get a bit of a glimpse into his abusive upbringing. Although him being the son of Brachus, there's more to it than that, let's just say. But then further twist on top of the twist, Adam is actually working with Nazmul and has led him, Malco, and Flinch straight to Brachus knowing that Brachus has betrayed them. But then twist on top of the twist on top of the twist, Adam was actually never working with either party and was trying to wait for the perfect time to betray Nazmul but got cold feet when his plan would have put Kara in danger. There's like so much going on here, and the final action scene of the episode when the defenders break into the keep and fight Nazmul is right up there as being one of the best fight scenes in the show. Just great shot after great shot. Although I will say they once again get a little bit sus when Nazmul briefly captures Kara.
Nothing stands in my way now.
No! Please, no!
touch, bad touch, stranger danger.
Either way, while episode 11 may be my favorite episode of the first 2/3 of the season, I would say that episode 24 and 25 are in a very tight race for favorite episode of the overall season. Episode 25 starts out a little slow, but once it gets going, it's just cool action sequence after cool action sequence. Plus, it's also remarkable for the fact that it has possibly my favorite twist in the entire season, because Nazmul starts out the episode mortally wounded. Why Omniaxor didn't finish him off at the time, Lord only knows. But he's on death's door and doesn't have a host. Or does he? After staying quiet for most of the episode, Malko pipes up and it turns out that Nazmul took over Malko as a host, which is so unexpected, but it makes perfect sense because Malko has presented himself as possibly the most formidable secondary or tertiary enemy in the show thus far. But he's also far enough in the background that you don't often give him a second thought. So suddenly it's Nazmul in Malko's body against Brachus and an entire army. Oh, and by the way, this military commander, I just wanted to point out, his name is literally General Rube. No word of a lie. Then eventually, the army turns on Brachus, and then it's the defenders versus the army and Nazmul. The Deus Ex Machina is a bit of an ass-pull though. After being taken earlier into the season, the Nova Stone was modified to have a secondary function called Nova Prison, where you could lock someone's soul into the stone, which for a stone that had been nothing more than a handheld tactical nuke up to that point, just felt way too convenient. So in the end, Seth is able to trap Nazmul in the Nova Stone, and Brachus is presumably dead. Both the antagonists are defeated, which means there's only one more thing to handle, the megalith itself. They have the 4 Pure Stones and the machine, so everything's ready. Unfortunately, it's revealed that the spell would do great damage to, if not destroy the world. And it's only once they see the destruction firsthand that they decide they're going to eschew the spell and take their chances with the megalith. But I mean, the world's already half destroyed by the time they stop the spell, so might as well commit. But no dice. No pun intended. They let the megalith revive, and that takes us, finally, mercifully, to the season finale. And it's a bit of a disappointment, in all honesty. It opens up decently by showing how even in a weakened state, the megalith is still a formidable foe, but then they spend a really weirdly long amount of time in this sequence where this old lady is possessed by the megalith. The best part of this episode is easily the payoff with Kragus. A powerful blast separates Seth and Kragus, but without a stone to return to, Kragus' energy is dissipating. He is brittle and dying, and Omniaxor, out of a sense of remorse and a sense of duty towards both Seth and Seth's father, decides to fuse himself with Kragus to save his spirit. It's a very heart-wrenching moment, and an excellent payoff to the overall storyline. It's just a shame we never got other stories based on the Guardians, but for what it's worth, there really wasn't a lot of screen time to spare. This was definitely enough. Also, it's weird. Seth took some battle damage from the blast, but then his clothes seemingly just heal themselves. I guess it was easier than keeping track of where the tears were. The ending sequence is also pretty good as well, I suppose. They try the warrior henge channeled through Kara, but even though it's their most powerful attack amplified tenfold, it's still not enough. But they still got one more trick up their sleeve. The Nova Stone channeled through Kara.
That could kill Kara!
Hey, they said the thing. And that, finally, peaks the power scaling. Oh, and it's also enough to put the megalith down once and for all. And that's that. Rados is saved. Unfortunately, the ending is a bit of a dud. They were probably already renewed for Season 2 while they were writing the season finale, so they basically end the whole season on a cliffhanger. As it turns out, the megalith only existed as a result of the Wizards of Yan banishing an evil race called the Ethos to the Shadow Realm or the Dark Realm or something. But because the Defenders didn't cast the spell of binding, it creates the perfect atmosphere for them to make a comeback. And while watching the season finale, you'll see them occasionally cutting to this kid and wonder, who's this Jagballs? Well, this Jagballs is named Ryan, spelt in a really weird way. And he's the key to defeating the Ethos. I remember not liking this character growing up. Aside from replacing my at-the-time favorite character, he also reeks of unearned importance, and the constant never-ending mystery surrounding who he is gets really frustrating after a while. He's like Jason Grace from Heroes of Olympus, except somehow even more bland. But that's a discussion for another day. So how would I describe Season 1 of Di-Gata Defenders in a nutshell? Well, the phrase that comes to mind would be a mixed bag. There are some really rough patches in this show, particularly in the first 2/3 or so. There's good episodes and there's bad episodes, there's stilted writing and questionable plot decisions. There's shaky action sequences and odd animation, but ultimately by the end of the season I was actually starting to remember exactly what it was that made me like this show so much back in the day. When it hit its stride, I could see the potential being realized. Compelling drama. Action scenes on a level far above where the series started out. Interesting characters, interesting character dynamics. A lot of genuinely funny levity. Lore that, while confusing, was quite interesting. Unfortunately, a lot of that presents itself after the 2/3 mark, but that last third is genuinely good. It was to the point that I was actually questioning my main criticism of the writers having issues with paying off the things they set up. I had to remind myself, no, Mel being set up as Nazmul's vessel being dropped, Kara's inconsistent independence, the love triangle with Seth, Mel, and Adam having no fleshing out, Kara being poisoned and cured in the least interesting way possible, and several other individual characters or episode plots either having no resolution or being resolved in a very uninteresting way. But if I have to remind myself of certain things I don't like about the series, then clearly it's doing its job well, at least by the end. Which I guess speaks to the writers having a good sense for escalation, because by the end, it almost felt like a completely different show. Ultimately, Di-Gata Defenders Season 1, and yes, it is Season 1 regardless of what the listings on Disney XD will tell you, is the embodiment of missed potential. Whether it comes down to production interference, issues with the specific audience, rushed production, or just writers that weren't able to bring out the fullest potential of the series, Di-Gata Defenders is a show that borders on being really good but falls short. The last 10 episodes or so, they're really good, but the first 16 are kinda rough if I'm being honest, which brings the season overall to being as mixed bags get. Considering I feel like I was the only one who cared about this show or even remembered it, it felt like my cross to bear for a long time. My curse. And now I pass this curse onto you all. A curse of knowledge about a show you probably never even heard of before this and probably don't care about, but now are more knowledgeable about than most shows. And if you wish to watch it in full, despite the fact that I just spoiled a large majority of it, there are several archives of it on YouTube. Fair warning though, none of the archives are complete, so you have to jump back and forth, but between the archives, the complete series is on YouTube. With that said, however, there was a Season 2. I may have hinted at this briefly, but let me tell you something. That hypothetically might be the hardest thing I will ever cover, if I even get that far. But I promise, if this video does well, I'll cover Season 2 eventually. Just as soon as I get up the nerve to rewatch episode 44, trust me, it ain't pretty. To call that an old wound would not be doing it nearly enough justice. Maybe I'll even cover the DS game, because somehow, even 20 years later, this is a show I just can't get away from. But that's it for me. I'm assuming this was quite a curveball to a lot of people, but I hope you enjoyed it. This descent into the absolute bottom of my subconscious, and if you like it, be sure to leave a like on this video, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.